Wise Squirrels is brought to you by The Root Down, an ADHD-inspired presentation and process to know, respect, and connect yourself. Available now for conferences and savvy companies, The Root Down will bring your team together, teach them about neurodiversity, and a lot more. Check out The Root Down, read the reviews over at wisesquirrels.com today. Welcome to Wise Squirrels, a podcast for late diagnosed adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Dave Delaney. This week, I've got something different for you. So if this is your first episode, you may want to listen to one of the earlier episodes. This week, I am going to share an interview that the one and only Erik Fisher did with me, your chief Wise Squirrel. So Erik is the host of the awesome Beyond the To-Do List podcast, which I highly recommend you check out. And Erik, like you probably, he's also a wise squirrel. And so we talk a lot about my own journey and how the Wise Squirrels was born in the first place, and a heck of a lot more. So sit back and relax and enjoy Wise Squirrels featured on Beyond the To-Do List.
This week, I was excited to welcome back to the show Dave Delaney. He's no stranger to me. He's a friend of mine, but also he's a digital marketing, social media strategy, keynote speaker on business networking, also an author, a veteran podcaster. In fact, he's got a brand new show called ADHD Wise Squirrels, which is a great resource. It's really taking off. And that's why I wanted to bring him back, because I knew he had this great new project. And before we get into his adult ADHD diagnosis, we talk briefly about his sobriety journey that he started just before the last time he was on the show. We talk about the why and the how of that and how he has kept that going. And then we jump into, again, his adult ADHD diagnosis and then awareness that brought him and the first steps for treatment that he's gone through, and honestly, ongoing things he's learned in his journey so far, talking with other experts on his ADHD Wise Squirrels podcast. We also talk about how ADHD manifests differently for different people, the connections it has with anxiety and depression, and ultimately, this conversation is about noticing signs and giving you permission to be okay with checking if you or someone you know is struggling with this but may not know it. So let's get into this conversation with Dave Delaney. Well, this week, it is my privilege to welcome back to the show Dave Delaney. Dave, welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be back. It's great to reconnect.
Let's see. So you've been on the show, I don't know how many times. I should probably start doing homework. No, I know what I'm doing. I didn't think to, because it's like, who cares if it's 3 or 4 times? It's at least 3 or 4 times. And we've known each other for a very long time. And you've been on the show a number of times. We've talked about a number of different topics, networking multiple times. And what's funny is I think the last time you were just then starting to, or barely had gone sober during the pandemic. And then also we're talking about distractions and things, irony in some ways. So, yes. You know, people who've listened to the intros know we're talking about ADHD today. But before we go there, let's do a sobriety check. Are you sober right now? No, I know you are. It's dry January, but also how is that going? Like, let's talk about that again. Let's do a couple minute quick revisit, because I think it bleeds into the ADHD journey.
Yeah, no, it totally does. Yes, I am still sober. I quit drinking for 30 days in June of 2020, and I discovered delicious non-alcoholic beers. And I'm like, well, these are pretty good. So I started drinking those when I would, partake with friends. And then I kept finding these good non-alcoholic beers. We took a trip to Europe and we were in Brussels. We were in Bruges, or in Belgium rather, in Bruges. And I'm like, I'm just going to stick with non-drinking, still not drinking alcohol. So I drank the non-alcoholic beers there, which were stellar, of course. And then after that, I'm like, well, now that I've been to the place in the world that has the best beer and I didn't drink the beer, the regular beer, the alcoholic beer, I'm like, well, what the hell's the point of stuff? Like I'm not going to like start drinking again just to drink like, some crappy beer here or something. Not to say, I mean, there's plenty of good beers. So yeah, 30 days became 60, became 90, and I just celebrated like 1,200 days. It'll be 4 years this June.
Great. I'm glad to hear it. And partly people that are listening to this show regularly know I had a recent episode with Jillian Teets. Her brand is Sober Powered, and we talked about preparing for dry January and her journey. And so I thought, we got to bring it up. I mean, it's part of who you are in a lot of ways. I really admire you making that step at a time where I know I was doing the opposite, and a lot of the world was too, and that you've stuck with it. And so, I mean, have you found clarity? You've probably found some weight loss, obviously. Well, to a certain extent, because you're still drinking non-alcoholic and those still have calories, but the alcohol has probably not weighed you down as much, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've definitely been able to feel clear, sleep much better. Those are probably the two main things. But then like even, and as we get older, like you have one too many beers or whatever that you're drinking with friends. And like, oh man, I'm 50 now. Like those hangovers last like a freaking week. Like my wife still drinks, but not very often. And she's kind of a lightweight, but she'll have like a vodka with friends. And then the next like day, she's like, oh, why did I do that? Like, oh, what is wrong with me? So yeah, the lack of hangovers certainly has been great. My friends love me because I'm always the designated driver now.
Love it.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for some non-alcoholic brewery to be like, Dave, influencer, let's go. Because yeah, God knows I preach a lot about all the wonderful brands of non-alcoholic beers. So
I'm really looking forward to the next time. It's been way too long. I can't remember when it was. Honestly, I think it was pre-pandemic since I think it was 2019, late 2019 that I was down in Nashville area where you are. So we haven't had the chance to go have a non-alcoholic drink together. So I'm looking forward to that at some point here soon this year. Let's do it this year. I will make it happen. So
I am on board.
But I can't help but think that you going through that step first allowed you to think, even in a subconscious level, something about some of your other thought patterns, tendencies, etc. Do you think that played a part in starting to inch towards nudges from maybe your wife and maybe your own internal subconscious when it came to ADHD? Let's talk about how you discovered / decided to, what was your journey like pre, and then what was the catalyst moment, if you can remember it, super clearly or whatever. But when it comes to your ADHD, okay, I'm going to get tested. I'm going to get diagnosed.
Yeah, great question. So, and actually, this will be the moment when I shamelessly plug ADHD Wise Squirrels, which is, of course, being a veteran podcaster and an ADHDer, I'm like, oh, I need to start a podcast and share my journey and my story and also interview experts and high achievers with ADHD on the show. So yeah, obviously I jumped at the opportunity to do that and it's been fantastic. So to go back to your question, 2020 was not the year that I was diagnosed, but it was just such a big year of stress, both from just the political climate. I mean, obviously it was just kind of a terrible time then with, police violence and Black Lives Matter, all of these.
Lots of factors. Yeah. I mean, the pandemic itself, the ones you just mentioned. Yeah. And at that point, we didn't know, we had no thoughts or inklings of any kind of vaccine anytime soon. So
right.
Totally get it.
So my year started January 2020, things were looking really great. I do a lot of presentations as a keynote speaker. And so things were going really well. And I was working with Google as a speaker for Google for 5 years. So January was great. February was like, what's going on here? I started hearing rumblings about COVID. March 2020, the world shut down. But in addition to all the stress and things that were going on at that time, I decided to make a few different changes. One of them was that my wife and I decided to start seeing a virtual fitness coach because we knew we needed to be exercising more in part to build our immune systems and just to make sure that we were making healthy choices. But then in March of 2020, a tornado blew through Nashville and destroyed my kid's school and, a friend's house. And, it was just an extremely, add that to the stress. Fast forward from March 2020 to May 2020, we get another storm. It's a derecho, which is a straight line windstorm, 70-mile-an-hour winds. And that one kicked us out of our house. We had to move out of our house for 3 months because we lost 7 trees. We had 10 holes in our roof, a branch like shish kebab, my roof and attic right into my living room. So then my job was as a speaker, not speaking a lot because not a lot of opportunities to go and speak places. So my business was in a rough way. So I had a lot of stress with that, plus this kid's school, plus the pandemic, plus now dealing with the insurance and contractors. And that was a nightmare. And so 3 months of living out of our house and dealing with that. I say all that because at that time I started drinking a little too much and I was like, okay, I need to take 30 days off. And that's when we got to that June of 2020. This is a long-winded way of answering your question, but I swear I'm landing the plane now. Fast forward to 2023, last year, I joined a mastermind with 2 friends, and one I know very well, the other I didn't know. And we started meeting weekly to discuss our businesses. And the one I didn't know very well sends me a text out of the blue one day and says, dude, do you have ADHD? And I said, no. And he said, I think you do. And you need to go see your doctor. And he has ADHD. So he saw it in me. And I was like, okay. So I went to see my doctor, and there's a longer version of this story, but the short version, I'm happy to share that too. But the short version is he diagnosed me with ADHD then. That's kind of how I got to this point. The longer version is actually I saw a psychologist in 2016 who apparently diagnosed me with the ADHD, but for some reason I did not get the memo. And so when I saw my doctor last year, he looked at my charts and he was like, oh, I did some questionnaires and things with him. And then he looked up my charts in his computer and he's like, oh, Dave, he's like, yeah, back in 2016, it looks like you were a candidate for ADHD. And I'm like, huh, okay. Well, what's 5 years and 50, of being diagnosed a little later than planned. So that's where we are.
I think it's hilarious to hear that you were, but didn't even know you were, because you say you missed the memo. That's so ADHD.
I know. And I mentioned it to my wife and she's like, well, and to your point, like my wife, who's a school teacher and who is obviously, teaches children of all types. She said it multiple times over the years and the stress, had a stressful year in 2016. And that led to going to see the psychologist. And also my wife was like, I think you have ADHD. So last year was a stressful one as well. And as was 2020, obviously for all the reasons discussed. So yeah, I was diagnosed last year at 50.
Which that in and of itself, it's one of those things where it's like, actually, I should probably add in here, I also have it. I also have been diagnosed. Now, okay. When I was diagnosed, I think it was the summer of 2005. So here we are almost 20 years in, and my journey's a little bit different. But yeah, I think that being diagnosed as an adult, especially, further up in years, not that we're ancient, but it's one of those things where it's like, well, it may change the way that you look at yourself. You may think, no, I don't have it. You may hesitate to even approach the diagnosis or seeking it out because you think that can't be right. How can it have been true this whole time, but me not know it? I mean, did you have any of that doubt? I mean, you had a couple people that were kind of pointing it out, but.
Yeah, no, I didn't. Partly because, well, beyond the people pointing it out and the more that I learned of ADHD, I'll be clear to share some of the things that I've been learning, obviously, with everybody. Like, for example, ADHD shows differently in different people. So that's an important point because some of the symptoms may be different. Also, things like anxiety and depression are comorbidities. And I didn't know that word before.
Okay, explain that, because I think some people may not know what that means.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, they're basically, and I could be butchering it, but my understanding is they're sort of symptoms of ADHD, or they can be symptoms. So if you've been diagnosed with anxiety, for example, another thing in 2020, because of all the stress, is I was seeing an online therapist, but they were not a psychologist or psychiatrist, so they couldn't diagnose me with anything. But she thought that I was suffering from anxiety, which was accurate, and some depression, more heavier on the anxiety. The anxiety she got right for sure. And that is something that I've explored more this year. But again, these are things that could be caused by the ADHD as well. So yeah, it's been a great revelation. But to answer your question, yeah. So my mom kept all my old report cards, and I had them in a box in my closet. And after the diagnosis, I got it down, and my wife and I read through them and laughed our heads off when reading the comments from the teachers, and, just how clear that I was like, oh my God, it's so obvious that I had ADHD and still have it. Of course, that's another thing I wanted to point out too, that I've learned is ADHD isn't something you develop. It is something and I'm still struggling with the term, and you've had it longer. Maybe you would have some insight here. I struggle with the word like having ADHD. You know what I mean? Like
a label. Yeah. It's right. Part of you.
Well, it's not even the ADHD. It's the have part. It's like, it's not a virus. It's like I am ADHD instead of I have ADHD. You know what I mean? Like you're born that way. So
yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah. And no, this is the wrong way to look at it. I guess the way that I've looked at it for so long is that it's part of my personality, and that's just how it is. And, take it or leave it. That's how I have to treat myself. That's how others have to treat me. It's how I have to navigate the world. If that's accurate or not, that's still how I personally look at it. I assume for you, it kind of, you said, you get out the report cards, it kind of retroactively changes your perspective on yourself and the world.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, there's a lot there. Like, it's interesting because if you're diagnosed as an adult, and again, I've been interviewing these experts and, kind of high achievers. Like, I interviewed Dr. Bob Dempsey, the former director of NASA's little operation called the International Space Station. You probably never heard of it. But like, he was the director of the ISS for 16 years, and he was diagnosed with ADHD at 60 years old. And now he works with like Blue Horizon. Yeah. So to answer your question, one of the biggest dangers I have found in having conversations and researching and reading and writing and podcasting and developing a new presentation and writing my new book all about this stuff, one key area that I find important, among others, is the importance of not dwelling on the past in a negative way. So, a lot of people, if you're diagnosed later in life, you might start thinking about all the what ifs, oh man, if I'd known I have ADHD as a kid, I could have been treated. I could have had medication. I could have had therapy, and then I could have, been someone. I could have been a contender. So you can easily go to dark places by doing that. But thankfully, if anything good came from 2020, I think it was all preparation ahead of 2023 for me to handle this diagnosis. So another thing I didn't mention, and something I've written a lot about, is I started meditating, like a regular mindfulness and meditation practice in 2020. And it's something I dabbled with over the years, but it's something I finally started taking seriously for my own mental health during all that stress. And it's something I still do today. But again, part of that, you learn about not thinking about too much about the past or the future for that matter, but really focusing on the here and now, the present.
Okay. So I know that you mentioned Wise Squirrels, your podcast and everything. You've talked with some great people. I want to jump into those lessons. Before we do some of those, I got to ask, like, initially you're thinking, okay, I'm diagnosed, and now what do I do? Quick sidebar. My hope is people are listening to this conversation, and if they've had suspicions, they can check with others, see what they think, trusted, accountability, people, friends, family, etc., like you and I both have had happen. But then also maybe get away from a little bit of the anxiety, the depression, the guilt that they may be feeling, and really get checked and tested and diagnosed one way or the other to know how to progress forward. That is really my ultimate hope. I thought when I said, let's talk to Dave, that was kind of my end outcome that I had in mind. To that end, I hope that's what's happening right now. I hope people hear that and think, oh, Erik just gave me permission and Dave echoed it.
Yeah, 100%. That's the goal of Wise Squirrels. It's the goal of the presentation that I've developed called The Root Down, which I can tell you more about later. So there's a person, an authority in the space who is now retired, but still YouTubing frequently. And he's a gem. And his name is Dr. Russell Barkley. And Dr. Russell Barkley is really, really outspoken, well-known in the ADHD community as like the guy or one of the people who's just such an expert. He's retired, but he still does these YouTube videos all the time. What he does is he reviews research and then does YouTube videos disproving or proving or throwing people under the bus, and with good reason, like Jordan Peterson, who's shared all sorts of misinformation or maybe even disinformation about ADHD. And so he does such a good job with it. I bring him up. There's also a great resource called ADA, the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, which we should also mention. ADD and ADHD, that is the same thing. The acronym changed. We can talk about that, but it is the same thing. So if someone says ADD, ADHD, it's one and the same. But I mentioned Dr. Barkley because he's researched multiple studies and found that the average lifespan for somebody with undiagnosed and untreated ADHD is approximately 13 years, or can be 13 years less than a neurotypical person, meaning somebody without ADHD, or somebody with ADHD that is receiving treatment for the ADHD. So it could be up to 13 years less.
Wow.
That's a big part of why I'm trying to remove stigmas and educate folks as well. So it's important.
It's really important. So, what were your thoughts when you first were diagnosed and so how do I proceed forward with treatment that's going to immediately help you, but also knowing then, okay, this is a journey. I'm going to learn more. And that's also partly where we go with the podcast and your guests. Yeah.
So at wisesquirrels.com, there is a free assessment there. There's a link there. I don't see the results. So that's a good starting point if you're curious and you want to do an assessment just to see. But regardless of what the outcome of that assessment, regardless of what it is, it can help you get an idea if maybe you have ADHD. But the most important thing is seeing a doctor. So going to see first your family doctor probably, and then maybe a psychologist or a psychiatrist who can actually diagnose you or not. So you really have to go see, a licensed doctor who can actually diagnose you to be able to receive a diagnosis. So as I said, I was diagnosed in 2016. When I saw my doctor last year, he saw that in the system, and he also did some exercises and assessments with me. And we concluded, yes, in fact, I have ADHD. So your family doctor can prescribe meds. So he prescribed me some stimulants. That's a common thing for ADHDers by the way, I say wise squirrels because wise, it's for late diagnosed adults. So it's wise because of the wisdom we've earned in our lives, dealing with not knowing we have ADHD, but still surviving and thriving. And then squirrel because
yes, exactly.
in case anyone's wondering. Yeah. So I went and saw my doctor. He prescribed me meds. And then we started going back and forth on changing the meds or updating the dosage, kind of starting low and gradually getting higher in order to get a better understanding of what might help me. What we concluded too was that I wasn't really seeing the results that I wanted from that. So my doctor recommended a psychologist to meet with a specialty in ADHD. And then she assessed and prescribed me a different medication, a different stimulant. And we went through sort of a trial and error, not error, but a trial, the same sort of thing until we landed on something. But before we did, we actually stopped and realized that we needed to treat my anxiety more first. And so we went back starting from scratch in a way with treating my anxiety. So now I'm on a medication for that and then reintroduced the stimulants. And now I'm in a much sweeter spot. Still experimenting with the dosage of the stimulants, but that's kind of where I am now.
That's great to hear. And I think that's a really good example of one, it manifests or exhibits in different ways. No diagnosis is the same as anybody. Like the way that our personalities are different is also the same way that the way that we have it exhibit itself, the symptoms, in other words, the way the symptoms show is going to be different and the way you treat them is different. It's not one-to-one. It's all different. And it's good to know that ahead of time. And I think that, and I can say to myself, or I can say as far as myself, it was the same exact way.
Yeah.
I started on meds right away. It really wrecked my sleep. Although part of that was probably that we had a 6th or 7th month preemie newborn in the house at that time. And that really didn't help either. And I kind of said, you know what? I'd rather just go off completely and come back around to it later. So that's a different journey, obviously.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, there are certainly, I mean, it's not like ADHD is completely different for everybody either. I mean, there are certainly commonalities. I mean, it is an acronym, right? I should also add that a couple different points. One is that women are being diagnosed, I guess, maybe with some more frequency now. And the reason why is because of our sexist history. Not ours. Erik and I are not sexist. But the medical professional or industry where ADHD or ADD back in the day was always thought of as this naughty boy syndrome. It was a naughty boy thing. The boy was hyperactive, couldn't sit still in class, goofed off constantly. I was a complete class clown, so it makes a lot of sense there. But they didn't think it was something that girls could have, or they were too sexist to see it or whatever.
Or didn't even call the boys out on it in a way. It was just that It was behavioral problems.
Yeah, exactly. True. So for girls, ADHD often shows differently in the sense that, like, with the hyperactivity part, they're more mentally fixated on stuff, daydreaming out the window, playing with their hair, just that kind of thing, and not really jumping around out of their desks in the classroom. So it's less obvious or less apparent. So yeah, so everybody, it doesn't matter your gender or whatever.
I'll interject and say that's how mine was. I was way more like what you just described, playing with my hair when I had some. And, one of the things my wife noticed once when we were first kind of dating was I was kind of pushing my hair back over my ears, but there was no hair there. I had that kind of undercut, buzzed kind of look there. And she's like, why do you keep moving your hair? And I just didn't think anything of it, but it was kind of like that.
Right. So there's like two categories. And again, to be clear, I'm not a doctor, right? So this is just the stuff I've learned, but there's two like main categories of ADHD. There's like the impulsive hyperactive type, and then there's the inattentive distractible type. And there's some commonalities. And again, it's not one size fits all or anything like that, but yeah, absolutely. So that's part of the reason why it was more, kind of ignored or missed in a lot of girls. The other thing too is now that it's known as ADHD and the H is hyperactivity, as soon as I was diagnosed, now I've always been very transparent and open, and I don't know, I just like sharing my journey with people. So I wrote a blog post and posted on Facebook, hey, guess what, everybody, I have ADHD. I joke that I kind of like came out of the mental health closet, as it were. And I got all these messages from friends and people. And one person, actually several, said, I thought I have ADHD, but I'm not hyperactive. And hyperactivity it shows up differently, in different types, but it also shows up differently in adults where you're not bouncing around the room. So two of the ways for me, one, you'll be like, oh, okay. And the other, you might think that sounds kind of weird. The first is like chewing your lips, chewing the inside of your mouth. I do that chronically, always have, to the point at periods where I couldn't even go to sleep because I'm still chewing the inside of my mouth. And that's, more common than we know. The other thing that's really weird in a way is I love wearing soft t-shirts and always have loved the touch and feel of my soft t-shirts, not like someone else. I'm not going to go and reach and touch your shirt. That's weird.
I mean, you have done that to me before. Let's be honest.
Well,
but
yeah, that's true. That is true. And I used to play with your hair as well. So I do this thing where like, I'll like kind of touch my shirt and I'll do it like under the table. And I'm not even thinking of doing it like I'm hiding it. I just do it that way. And my wife's always known. She sees me doing it. She's like, and I'm like, I don't know why I always do this. And I'm reading Dr. Tamara Rossier's book, Your Brain's Not Broken. That was the first book I read. I've since interviewed her on my podcast, by the way, and she's awesome. She's incredible, tons of fun, and just great resource. But I interviewed her on my show and I was telling her about this and she was laughing. She's like, yeah, and as I was reading her book, I told her, I was like, oh my God, that's totally me. And I messaged Heather and she's like, oh, like, I know, like this is part of the ADHD too. So anyway, just the hyperactivity thing can show up in different ways, not just like jumping around the room.
Yeah, it's integrated into the senses and the sensory, the way that you want to reach out to sense the world, but also the way that you actually sense the world coming at you is the best way I've kind of felt I can describe it myself.
Yeah. And something else that's interesting about ADHD is that, and again, not a scientist, but my understanding is that it affects your prefrontal cortex is where the front of your brain ultimately. And your dopamine receptors aren't as good as, quote unquote, a neurotypical, right? So somebody who doesn't have ADHD or other neurodiversity. And I say that because it's an interesting thing because of the lack of dopamine you're receiving, you crave it and you try to find ways to produce it. So like I interviewed Peter Shankman, who's a serial entrepreneur, popular digital marketing fella, like, kind of from our school, I guess. I've known Peter a long time and he's written a couple books about ADHD. He has a great podcast as well. Now, luckily he had a great exit from his company, Haro, that allowed him to afford the luxury of jumping out of planes. And he loves skydiving. And he's like, it's the ultimate dopamine rush. But with ADHDers or wise squirrels, we are craving dopamine all the time. And I realized for me personally, as a keynote speaker, and, I perform improv and comedy and things, when I'm standing in front of a stage and I'm receiving feedback from the audience, they're laughing and so on, I'm on cloud nine. I'm receiving a huge rush of dopamine and I'm like, oh, this is amazing. And it's this huge revelation for me that is why I love to do what I do and why I love people and networking and meeting others. All of this stuff creates dopamine for me. Now I'm extroverted as well, but that really does help. Now, the flip side and what I mentioned earlier about your life expectancy, a big reason why people die earlier with untreated ADHD is because it's partly about like making poor choices, being impulsive. So like, this could result in a car accident that kills you. But addiction is another big factor. And it's something that for me personally, I used to drink like a fish back when I was in my 20s and even younger. And when I would smoke like the entire pack. And again, I've quit smoking many decades ago. And when I drank, it wasn't that like for me, it wasn't an addiction in the sense that like I had to drink, but it was more that if we went for a couple of beers, I would have a couple more beers. So there was this joke. My wife always teased me about how excessive I am. So this lack of dopamine can also be received through addiction, through smoking or drinking or drugs, like not all drugs, but bad drugs. And this is why a lot of people end up ODing or, something like that. So anyway, I'll shut up for a minute and breathe so you can speak. That's the other thing with ADHD. I ramble. Hello.
It makes you a good podcast guest. I was going to say,
and I know listeners are like, right. And he's on medication today.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the main differences between us is you're extroverted. I'm introverted. Now I get to flip my, turn my podcasting equipment on like it's my Iron Man suit and use it to be out there in the world to be in front of people and do cool things. That's not to say I'm not doing cool things outside the suit too, but
yes,
billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, something. That's the line, right? From Avengers.
Yeah.
Take that suit away. It's to say that you are, as an extrovert, you're charging yourself up as you are fulfilling that need. Whereas as I fulfill that need, I then have to back away to then recharge. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit cyclical, but that's, again, I want to call that out as a difference that people might hear. You know, again, there's a prism here and it's a spectrum. So
yeah, my understanding, at least what I know, is whether you're extroverted, introverted, ambivert, I don't know. And again, I'm not an expert here, but I don't know of any relation or connection to neurodiversity or ADHD for that. You know, I wrote in my book, New Business Networking, and a lot of the work that I've done, and, you know, even talking to you on the podcast before about networking, you know, I've done a lot of work around writing and thinking for, you know, networking for introverts, because obviously for extroverts, it's not too difficult. And also, to be clear, as you said, it is a spectrum. So like, I'm not 100% extrovert and you're not 100% introvert.
Right.
I'd be out somewhere talking to everybody I could find if I was 100%, and you wouldn't be talking to me at all right now if you're 100% introvert. Nobody is. And ambivert, I just think, is a bit of a whatever. It's like the middle, but yeah, it's like, come on.
So the thing is that, and I know you, as you've been talking, you've been kind of, you know, inserting / sharing things you've already learned. What are some of the big, like, bombshell things? You probably, I mean, you shared a couple of them already, really. But as you've talked with these different experts like Tamara and Peter Shankman, who's been on the show, by the way, he's been on my show.
Yeah, he's great.
And you've talked to Rob Hatch as well, who works with Chris Brogan. So in other words, you've had at least 2 or 3 different guests on your show already that I've had on mine, which is great. So I knew, like, when I was going through your episodes, I'm like, you're on the right track. This is really, really, really good as a resource.
Well, and so I'm going to comment and answer your question there, because it's one of the revelations I've learned is that you are far more likely to explore entrepreneurial means with ADHD. ADHD is common among entrepreneurs and creatives as well. So, you know, I think of, you know, brands like Virgin, JetBlue, IKEA are just, you know, some of the first 3 that come to mind. In the presentation I do, the root down, I talk a lot about this, and in the book that I'm working on now too. This is a big one. So yeah, so to answer your question, like, that was a big revelation, was how many creatives have ADHD, how many entrepreneurs also, because with ADHD, you know, you tend to take risks, good or bad, and you tend to think outside the box. Sorry about the old cliche, but that tends to happen. And so it's a great operating system, as I like to call it, for entrepreneurs and stuff to have ADHD. So it's interesting that way.
You've probably heard people, and I've heard people go both ways with this. Some have said, oh no, don't think of ADHD as a disability. Think of it as a superpower. But then other people are like, yeah, don't call it a superpower. I struggle. I have empathy for both of those. I've been able to tap into it and use it like a superpower sometimes, but dang, it's a struggle.
100%. Yes, it is a huge struggle. Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not super rosy about it all the time either. You know, there are definitely advantages, you know, as I've mentioned, for like creatives and entrepreneurs. But yeah, no, it absolutely is a struggle. By the way, there's also tons of ADHD coaches who are, you know, certified. Some are better than others. Many have been on my podcast too, who are not like doctors or, you know, they're not even medically trained per se, but they have studied helping people with ADHD. And so they can coach you. I'm seeing a coach who is fantastic that specializes in ADHD. So who understands executive functioning skills and who can help me with that stuff. But I brought the coach up because I feel part of the curse of it is, and getting back to the creative side and entrepreneurial side, is that when you get in the zone, you know, we talk a lot and a lot of hustle porn that you, in the culture, you know, you hear people are striving to get in the flow, to get flow, which is like a legit thing. And with ADHD, you do get fixated on something. And whatever you are excited about and really in the zone for, you can go full steam ahead with ADHD. You're fixated, hyperfixated. The bad side about it is as if there is like a wall between you and the task that you need to do. You know how to do it, but for whatever reason, you don't want to do it and you can't do it. And it's like paralyzing and incredibly frustrating because you know you need to do that thing and you just, for whatever reason, you just can't do it. And it's incredibly annoying.
Okay, where is the camera in here that you have been watching me from? Because that's been a lot of, it's a camera in my head. You never had a camera in my head. Anyway,
right.
That's Jim Carrey from Truman Show. Anyway, yeah, that's what it feels like.
Also, he has ADHD.
In a very obvious way, in a lot of ways. It's almost easy to call that one out for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But he's definitely a wise squirrel because he's up there in years and he's kind of mellowed in some ways, but he approaches life that way. His Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee episode is one of my favorites. So,
I mean, he's so good. He's so talented. Definitely somebody I want to interview for the podcast as well. Fellow Canadian too. So who knows?
Nice.
Maybe he'll answer the right calls. But I wanted to mention, to that point, and this is something I actually did a video about this, and I plan to do more videos kind of sharing what I'm going through with this. But I wrote in my journal also another thing that I talk about, the importance of journaling. Overwhelm equals paralysis equals stagnation. And I wrote this down because I had this revelation with my therapist recently that when I am overwhelmed, and this is an ADHD thing, when you become overwhelmed about something, you hit that paralysis mode. And if you don't do that thing, then it's stagnation time. You're just going to be stuck. And so we all have to do things we don't want to do, certainly in life. But another big revelation and part of this adventure for me is the importance of giving myself grace so that if I'm dragging my heels on doing something that I know that I need to do now, I understand why it is the way it is and giving myself enough grace to be like, okay, it's okay. I could do it tomorrow, or not to procrastinate it to the point of not doing it, but, just find ways to, make it more fun. I'll actually share very quickly the journal entry that I wrote. I won't really read the whole thing, but what I'll share with you is that when I am feeling overwhelmed, and I made a little list of things to do, and I encourage, folks to try this or yourself. So one is meditation and mindfulness. The second is to break big projects into small chunks. The third is to reward myself. So if I do it, go have some pizza or whatever. Visualize the end. So think about the end. Envision that. Manifest the future. Daily journaling, as I mentioned, and that's how I came up with this. Blocking my calendar to times in the day to work on some things I don't want to do. And then also getting help from my friends or outsourcing. And to outsource, I've learned about what's called the Eisenhower Matrix, which is something you can find. You can see the matrix at wisesquirrels.com. I wrote a blog post about this, and it's from the one and only Dwight Eisenhower, the former president. But it's this matrix he created of deciding how to delegate or decide on things to do. And so I wrote a blog post about that because I found it really helpful. So those are just some things. And I find again, I thought to myself, overwhelm equals paralysis equals stagnation. But then I opened my journal and wrote it down, and I'm looking at it okay, great to know this. Doesn't help. And then I started thinking about, okay, so what do I do when I reach that feeling of overwhelm? And so that's kind of where I landed.
Journaling is one of the biggest things for me. Honestly, my practice of that is one of the things I wanted to revamp. And I know I'm not a New Year's resolution kind of person, but it was one of the things that recently I've been noticing needed to be reinstated and reconfigured. And it was because of this exact thing. It was a revisit. It was a check-in. It was a ask yourself certain questions regularly and being surprised at the thoughts and conclusions that don't just come from doing it once, but come from doing it continually. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. And one of the things I wrote, and I think it was before I was diagnosed, it's interesting to look back at things I wrote or talked about and be like, oh, that's why I thought that, or that's why I came up with that solution. But for some reason, I created this undue stress about journaling because originally I was treating it like a diary. And then I realized I saw some talk or something, somebody was talking about journaling. And I realized, like, wait a minute, my journal can just be like pages filled with like scribbles or a recipe or a sketch or a whatever, or the journal entry that I write can be a paragraph or it can be pages. It doesn't matter. It's almost like morning pages from, Julia Cameron from the Artist's Way. It's just giving yourself permission to write a paragraph or a sentence and call it a day. But the point is to like use the journal and also that's another thing with ADHD is you have to find what works for you. So there may be apps that work for you. It may be better on your computer in a Word document or Google Doc or whatever. It may be better in a written analog journal or scraps of paper or a legal pad or whatever. So it's finding what works best for you as well.
Well, and I'm going to call out that analog versus digital is also something to really consider. One of the things that Rob Hatch, when he was on my show last, talked about, and I've shared this tip a number of times, but I'm going to share it again here because it fits, is this idea of having like the legal pad, the analog legal pad sitting here that you can pull over, right? Yep. You're holding it up right there. You pull it over and you write on it and then you push it away and you acknowledge the thought and you then give yourself, it builds trust in yourself. In other words, that, oh, I've captured it. Now I can put that back out of my mind and focus back on the task at hand.
Yeah, no. And to your point, I mean, what I do is I'll fill up legal pads. Two things on that. One is when I meditate, I'll have a legal pad next to me. And so as I think of something that I want to remember, I'll jot it down. It used to be that if I think of something, I turn on my computer and go and write the article or create the event or launch a podcast or all the things. And instead, I just jot it down on the legal pad and get back to the breath and get back to like my meditation. And then like once a week or month, depends, I'll just like sit on the couch and go through all the notes of my legal pad. And there's so much satisfaction in just tearing out all the pages and throwing them in the recycling bin, but keeping some pages that have relevant things and then deciding like, what are the next steps or should I treat whatever it is that I wrote? So, but some of them are like, oh yeah, I did all this stuff already. Scrap and just ripping it out. But
yeah.
Feels good.
And just having your own frequency for that. Like if it's once a week, you go through those, fine. If it's, oh, you know what? I check it after the end of that actual meditation session. I just go through and, okay, is there anything that like I did write down here that's like today or tomorrow or this week? Let me park that where it goes. And it's just, it's knowing what the frequency is. So.
And this, by the way, this is all stuff that I am working on for my next book. It's also going to be, I think, a Kickstarter. And if your listeners would like to support me on this, I would be, eternally grateful. Of course, that would involve me creating a Kickstarter.
Yes. Well, first I'm going to say I'm going to jump in for sure.
Yeah.
And I've been taking notes all along of a bunch of different things to one, I want to point people to Wise Squirrels. I want to point them to davedelaney.me and then also Russell Barkley and his YouTube videos and all the other things that we mentioned. But I want to put all those in there because one, I hope people got a lot out of this conversation in terms of awareness first, and two, maybe a next step. I'll link up to that mini assessment thing that you've got on your site. That'll be another reinforcement, a little encouragement. You're not alone, all of that. And then two, what's funny is I'm giving away all the, hey, Dave, thanks for being here. I'm flipping it. I'm telling them all where the stuff is. I'm doing all the speaking at the end and I love it. So
yeah.
Anything else you want to call out? I've already called out wisesquirrels.com, davedelaney.me. What else would you call out?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're in podcast land here.
Yes.
So I encourage folks to search ADHD Wise Squirrels and you'll find the podcast. And I encourage you to follow it, check it out. If you like what you hear, or even if you don't, although hopefully if you like it, like we podcasters are known to do, please leave a review and a rating. And not just because, and do it for Eric's if you haven't yet too, because I'm going to do this part for you, Erik. Podcasters, we're doing the work. We're putting the content out in the world and we hope it's sticking and we hope people are finding it helpful. But besides like download numbers and things, I mean, really at the end of the day, we do this for our listeners. And so receiving feedback is just such a wonderful way to know that you're listening and know that you're enjoying it. So yeah, I do encourage you to check out the show and leave Erik a review here as well.
Well said. Dave, it's great to see you and talk with you as usual. Yeah, I can't wait to see you in person sometime soon, hopefully this year. In the meantime, let's stay connected online and we'll see you next episode.
Thanks, man.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed listening in on this conversation with Dave Delaney. I hope that you got some understanding, some awareness, maybe not for you, but maybe for other people around you that either you suspect may have ADHD or that you know have ADHD. And that maybe this gave you a little bit more, not just awareness, but understanding, empathy, spark some ways in your mind in which this can help you to help them. That said, if you feel like you suspect you might have it, definitely start by going over to Dave's site. You can find the link to that in the show notes where you can go and do that quick assessment. That's also where you can find the links to his podcast and everything else that he's doing, ADHD Wise Squirrels, among other things, different links to resources that were mentioned in this conversation. If you know of somebody that needs to hear this conversation, would you do them the favor and do me the favor of sharing this show with them? Hit that share button in your podcast player app of choice. Let them know you were thinking of them when you heard this and that you think it might be able to help them. Thank you so much for sharing.
Hey, thanks for listening to Wise Squirrels. It has been amazing to share this with you. Best way to show your support for the show, leave us a review, follow the show, and share it with the people in your life. We drop new episodes every 2 weeks, so stay tuned for that. Plus, drop by wisesquirrels.com or click the link in the podcast description, and you'll find a lot of different resources like articles, an assessment, a newsletter, lots of good stuff over at wisesquirrels.com. So drop by, let me know what you think, and we'll see you next time. Take care.